Greetings, all. So, I am coming on to talk to you a little bit about this upcoming eclipse that we have on May 5th. I have been thinking a lot about what it means to be a Venusian priestess. And I have to say that my understanding of that evolves as time goes on. And I know that in the past I have spoken to what the nodal axis is. It's essentially the nodes of the moon and how they travel through our chart, or through the world chart, the chart of the collective. The transiting nodes is what they're called, and how they are these really important evolutionary points in the chart. And they're also the places in which the eclipses happen. There are some master classes in the portal. There's one on Medusa that goes through all of the astronomy of what an eclipse is. So I'm not going to get into that today. I just want to speak a little bit to the archetypal nature and the evolutionary nature of eclipses. So eclipses move backwards in the sky, right? And there's a north node and a south node. So they're always exactly in opposition to each other wherever they are. And it takes about 18 months for a set of eclipses to move through a sign pair. And so an axis tells us, what two signs we're looking at, and they're always in opposition to each other. So when we talk about something like the Pisces Virgo axis, it's always going to be Virgo across from Pisces. It's always going to be Aquarius across from Leo. They don't switch up like that. So each sign pairing across the zodiacal axis tells us an evolutionary story, right? Like, it talks to us about how these pair of opposing forces work together, and when they're reconciled, something beautiful happens. So in January 2020, the nodes moved from Gemini and Sagittarius to Taurus and Scorpio. That was a really interesting nodal passage, the one we had prior to this with Gemini and Sagittarius. That happened just as we were moving into the pandemic. And Gemini rules things like media, information, the technology that we use to distribute media and information. And Sagittarius is involved with philosophical truths and the idea of the town square, and how as a collective we come to understand what the deeper or higher truths in the world are. Sorry, my computer's unplugged. That's going to be a problem. Hang on just a second. I didn't realize that. My apologies. Sorry. So anyhow, that nodal axis was active during the time that we were moving into COVID. And you could see how in the collective, we were really grappling with, how do we approach this gigantic problem? The idea about what is true and what is untrue was like obsessively on the table. People were getting canceled if their truths opposed the truths of others. It was a time in which bias in media and in reporting was really exposed. It was the first time that I entertained on a very deep and visceral level the amount of, I don't want to say it was an accurate reporting, but the way that the media uses psychology and bias to guide the population. And so it was interesting to see how, instead of having to use any kind of force to get the population to fall in line behind what the government wanted us to do, they just had to use this thing called psychological nudging. And that is a real thing. You can look it up. England actually got in trouble for the amount of psychological nudging that they used for COVID. And so that's what we were dealing with from an evolutionary perspective. when Gemini and Sagittarius were ruling the nodal axis. And it was a really exciting time in the sense of um, or from a spiritual perspective, because a lot of people were waking up. You know, it was like that whole period where we were mm, being exposed, kind of like um, the Great Oz and the guy behind the curtain. It kind of felt like we were being exposed finally to some of the mechanisms that run the show. So anyhow, in January 2022, it was a really interesting time. That's when the nodal axis changed from Taurus to from Gemini Sagittarius to Taurus Scorpio. I also got COVID right on the cusp of that, and Venus was in retrograde, about to start her new cycle. Now, the Taurus Scorpio axis is all about like accumulation, Taurus, and purging. Taurus is life, the Garden of Eden, what builds, grows, strengthens, and nourishes us, what gives us delight and pleasure. Pleasure for the sake of pleasure, in the sense of like it's an end in and of itself. To be fully embodied. In the tarot, Taurus is ruled by the Hierophant. So that's kind of that idea of like body gnosis, the spiritual inside the body, and using the body as an access or a gateway to spirituality. It's also ruled by Venus, and so there is this you know, there's all the things that Venus rules, like values and resources and how we hold those in our lives and how they show up. And resources can be more than just money, right? I mean, we resource ourselves psychologically, spiritually, we resource ourselves through our friends and our interactions. There's all types of different ways that we hold resources. It was a really interesting journey to embark with the North Node being in Taurus, and my sun is actually in Scorpio. So this was, you know, opposite all of the stuff that I've got going on in Scorpio. Was looking at for me that I was raised by parents whose parents, so my grandparents, were raised during the Great Depression, and so frugality and really being kind of tight with money, making things go a long way. That idea of like canning food, really stretching a dollar, getting the best deal. I watched how, you know, when someone would compliment something I was wearing, instead of just saying thank you, I would tell them how much I paid for it, that I got it on sale. Like I had all these really funny, weird hangups that I got to work through, and to look at my relationship to desire and see how I had trouble claiming my desire, how I had a lot of trouble just saying, I want this for the sake of I want it and it will make me happy, and not having it related to a quote unquote biological or physical need, but having it relate to just something that would inspire eros within my body, right? Just joy to light me up. And so this has been a deep exploration. I don't know that I have completed it totally. I keep finding these places where I'm unnecessarily tight with money. Of course, I'm not suggesting that anybody should just spend for the sake of spending. I'm talking about looking at our deeper patterns, looking at where they're born, and yeah, unwinding them a bit so we can be in a healthier relationship. So that's Taurus, and she's ruled by Venus. So opposing Taurus, then we have Scorpio. Scorpio is ruled traditionally by Mars. So with the 7 traditional planets, the rulership for Scorpio is Mars. But in our modern pantheon, that takes into consideration like the sun through Pluto, or even like myself, Eris, and our asteroid goddesses. The pantheon has grown much larger. And so it is also Pluto that rules Scorpio. And both of these planets, Mars and Pluto, are planets of personal power. They're how we know that we are empowered. So, for instance, somebody who has both Mars and Pluto in the 12th house, like my son did, they don't necessarily they're not necessarily in touch with their personal power, don't feel like they have access to their personal power in the same way that someone who has these planets in a good placement might. Now, so whatever we're dealing with a planet that has to do with power, we're looking at right uses of power versus like abuses or wrong uses of power. Um, and with Scorpio, the kind of power that we get, let's call it a plutonic power, is always the power we're deriving when we're in the underworld. So it's that empowerment that we get when we are stripped of all of our false mechanisms of power. So all of the external vestments of power that we don ourselves with, like having a good job that gives us power, or money that gives us power, these like external ego-based things. The plutonic power is that power that happens when we've traveled through all of the gates to the underworld, been stripped of all of the vestments of false power, had, have the ego attachment stripped away from us. We're kind of standing in the underworld naked, fully surrendered, in total trust of the universe that we're held safely, like in this bottom, feral, dark place. And in that moment of being stripped of our identity and the masks and all of the mechanisms that we use to create safety and certainty in our lives, we realize that we are the most powerful when we are that close to the essence self. So Pluto's power is very deep, and it to let's say to gain access to this type of power, we really are generally put through the ringer because we are being asked, or we are being stripped, sometimes unwillingly, of the power that that we've spent our whole lives investing and accumulating. And so this axis, like we said at the beginning, between Taurus and Scorpio is kind of this accumulation and purging axis. So Venus and Taurus, that building, growing, resources, nourishing, erotic, really good embodied place. It's slow, it likes food and wine. It's a connoisseur, and it's all about being alive here in the earthly delights and earthly pleasures. And Scorpio is all about like death and taking away all of those earthly pleasures. And like, what is left when all of that has been stripped out? When there is nothing left but the essence, the naked essence of who we are. And so and what's interesting is the nodal axis in itself, like the north node and the south node, can be thought of as holding similar resonance or actions with this nodal axis. So meaning the north node is a point of accumulation and the south node is a point of release. It's a point of purging. And so it's kind of like this whole year we've had like a full-on double signature of these energies, right? And so this can be external stuff like accumulation of money, resources, things, material matter, and purging, let's say, of like doing a really good spring clean out, or having something that you really loved and were attached to in the external world taken away from you. However, for a lot of people, myself included, this was much more a time of accumulating gnosis. For me personally, it was like on a psycho-spiritual level that the accumulation happened, and purging. And what I really ended up with is a deep relationship to paradox. And so the kind of lesson that I think I'm emerging with as we are having our last eclipse in Scorpio is this kind of like paradoxical gnosis, or knowing that I really do know everything I need to know. Like I trust that deeply, like that going back to the Wizard of Oz, you know, how Dorothy clicks her heels and they tell her home has always been with her. It's kind of like everything I need to know is already inside me. And then paradoxically, like I really know nothing. like I'm certain about nothing. And letting go of that idea of needing to know, needing to be certain about things. Like I have a deep gnosis, which is like connected to the deepest truth within myself that feels very, very, very empowered. It's what I feel like I've been initiated into during um, this evolutionary axis, this last 18 months. So it's like knowing I have that, but then also knowing that really nothing outside of myself, no piece of knowledge or information, no, reading a book or learning or figuring something out is actually going to save me. So it's been just such a gorgeous time. So now that we've talked about like where we've come through, I think it's a really wonderful idea to start thinking about the next 18 months and where you're going. And as a Venusian priestess, like, the other thing I was dropping in with was how associated Venus is to our values, and how, as women who are on a psycho-spiritual or an evolutionary path, that the being a stand for and speaking our values has never been more important. We had what does seem like a giant reset in 2020. We are most definitely, I don't know the exact moment we will be in the age of Aquarius. It's a very long process, but we're definitely in the threshold of the turning of the ages. And so it is us women who really have the embodied yes and no inside of us, who will be kind of setting the tone and creating the atmosphere that we're moving into, and in Aquarius, and with Pluto right now, just having transited into Aquarius the beginning of March, he's stationed retrograde May 1st, and he'll be leaving and then coming back into Aquarius and spending about 20 years here. Pluto kind of does this dance of like forward and backwards. So, he gave us a taste of what we see. And, for me, what I saw was a society of deeply unembodied people, right? So hopefully, these energies with Taurus and the Taurus Scorpio axis, as it finishes its journey on this axis, will help to precipitate whatever events people need to have happen in their own personal lives to help them get rooted deeper into their body. I think also Saturn in Pisces is another example of that potentially happening. But what I'm noticing is there is just so much egregore, so many thought forms out in the world, so many ideologies and social movements that just aren't rooted in the body or in the truth of reality at all. And so, Pluto comes to reveal, right? He comes to reveal what isn't healthy and what isn't aligned. And I think that, he's deeply shown me the level of dissociation that the collective is living in. And that's not to blame the collective. I mean, like I said, we had this huge moment of, all the puzzle pieces flying up into the air with 2020 happening. And then, as they've landed, they haven't quite organized themselves yet. And so there is this real, I think, psychological need that people have for certainty until they are at a certain level of spiritual and emotional maturity. And so part of the dissociation that's out in the collective and the really kind of distorted thought forms, I think, are a function of society's need to have certainty. And I really see this on both sides. It's really interesting when you kind of take a more meta perspective and you zoom lens out a little bit. There is a deep dissociation on either side of the political spectrum, right? So let's look real quick at the eclipse chart so that we can speak more directly to the energies that are in store for us. I'll share my screen here. So, all right. So as we can see, the eclipse is happening at 14 degrees Scorpio, so like the midpoint of Scorpio. And then we've also got Mercury and Vesta and Uranus and Taurus all very closely aligned with this scorpionic eclipse. And like I said at the beginning of the call, so people who have studied with me and who are doing my work and who are familiar with the Venus cosmology, they know that right now Venus is here she is. She's focalized at the throat chakra in the sign of Gemini, which rules communication. And Mercury is the sign that rules Gemini. And so we can look at Mercury, who's currently in retrograde and will be in retrograde during this eclipse, at some of our own values, Taurus, around communication and how our conditioning has really impeded our ability to speak. And it's not just our conditioning. So anytime the body is conditioned, there's generally a nervous system signature that goes along with that conditioning. Like, we remember a time when it wasn't safe to speak. We remember a time when we held an opinion that wasn't popular and it threatened our belonging and our, capacity or our perceived capacity to receive love and be left in the spot of the exile, right? And so part of what this eclipse is asking us to look at is Taurus having so much to do with the body and Mercury with the voice. It's not just intoning our speech with love, which can be a signature of Mercury and Venus coming together in each other's signs, is that we tend to be able to intone our speech with a little bit more love, a little bit more attunement, which is a good thing. But also, looking at the somatic body and what the experience is when we speak our truth into, whether it's an arena or like social media or in the classroom or in our homes. What is the experience our body has when we know that we're speaking to the edge of something, to something that might not be accepted or approved, but something that needs to be said? We are in a moment where there is a deep level of addiction and dissociation out in the collective. The amount of scrolling people do on their phones and binge watching TV, this is an attempt to distract ourselves from feeling the deep fear and kind of scarcity that we have in this very ungrounded place in which we've arrived, right? And like, there is a time in which we need to tell people the truth about something, and that truth might be difficult for them to hear. Like, for instance, not long ago, my daughter was kind of like relaying her perception of something that had happened, in her friend group. And I could hear the distortion in what she was saying. I could hear that her fear was feeding her pain body and making her feel afraid. And, we have this kind of, I don't know, paradigm in parenting right now where the rule is just to affirm for our children, validate for them every single feeling that they hold, right? And in this case, I felt like doing that for her would be a complete disservice. So I validated her feeling. Like, I can see how in this particular scenario, the way that you've got it set up, that it would elicit this feeling in you. But let me ask you a deeper question. Is it true? Is what you're telling yourself actually true? And when she sat with that for a little bit, she was annoyed and, did the whole like, you're not validating me kind of thing. But after she sat with it for a little bit, she realized that she was just afraid and that she had let the fear overtake her and create a story that wasn't rooted in reality. So see, sometimes with the people we love, we need to be able to speak truth to them. I think there's I don't know if it's a Bible verse, but I feel like it's associated with Christianity. This like, um, when you speak the truth, you speak life over someone, this kind of idea. And I think that is so true. And so with Mercury so close to this eclipse, it's this opportunity to not just know through gnosis and having like the deep knowing within the body, but it's to actually speak the truth and just to be tracking the nervous system and see where does it go out of range. And when it does go out of range, when the sensation builds and that makes it harder and harder for me to speak my truth, what are my wounds around being misunderstood? What are my wounds around using my voice? It's a deep epigenetic encoded program inside of women. If you look back at the ancestral history of the witch burnings and the way that we turned on each other, even women turned on other women during that time, there is a huge fear around speaking for women. And the throat chakra is often a very closed center, right? And so again, with astrology, right, with spirituality and even psychology, like a healthy psychology, we always want to look at balance. So we're not just looking at, do I speak the truth? But it's like, do I speak the truth in a way that lands without it losing its potency? Because the flip side of this is that then we end up fawning in our speech so that we can be heard and understood. We end up doing a little bit of like adding a bunch of flowery language around the truth that we want to say, and it dilutes the message a bit. So there's also like balancing truth speaking, being able to go in with absolute precision, say the thing that's true, say the thing that's hard, but do it in a way that it lands on the other side. And so asking ourselves, like, what is my level of discomfort if the person I've spoken truth to becomes upset with me? Like, can I allow them to hold their discomfort? And of course, this is age and development appropriate. You would never like expect a young child necessarily to be able to regulate their own nervous system. So, this is all about attunement, right? Taurus, Libra, Venus, these are all signatures that ask us to embody what it means to be attuned, right? So that Mercury is there by the eclipse, asking us to come into greater responsibility around our communication. And that doesn't mean responsibility. That doesn't mean isn't asking us to hold back what we're saying as a form of responsibility. It's asking us to say the hard thing in an attuned and honest way. And so then also right next to Mercury is the asteroid goddess Vesta. And Vesta is the signature of devotion in the chart. And she is really, I'm having my Vesta return. Mine's at 11. So in a few days, Vesta will be crossing over where Vesta is in my chart. And that really speaks to us about where we place our level of devotion and service in the world. And this is very close to the eclipse and to Mercury. And so we have this opportunity with the eclipse, which is it's opposite the eclipse. So it's the eclipse is happening down here in the chart. It's a full moon eclipse, so it's happening across the axis. And so it's asking us to look at what we are in service to, what we are in devotion to, potentially putting some communication around that or doing some refinement around that. Because it's an opposition, there's this way that there's generally, like I said, refinement and attunement involved. Whenever we have an opposition in the chart, it's kind of the nature of Libra. And like I said, Taurus, Venus, Libra are signatures of attunement, Libra being the most straightforward one, the one that we can really see that attunement is the overarching theme. And so we're asked to have some refinement around what we are in devotion to. And to, Mercury also rules things like the mail, communications, media. And so we may be asked to do a different approach, do a different email campaign, write differently, embody our communication in a different way. And then, of course, we have Uranus opposing the eclipse. And Uranus is, from an energetic standpoint, Uranus's action is like up and out. It's eruptive. One of my favorite astrologers to follow and watch, Rick Levine, says that Uranus is, he instantly reconciles irreconcilable opposites. And so it's like his action is that action of throwing all the puzzle pieces up in the air and having everything scatter and needing to look again at how stable the foundations are, right? He upends things. He is also the archetype of individuation. So archetypal astrologers hold that Uranus was potentially given the wrong name and that he should have been called Prometheus. And Prometheus as an archetype was the one who stole the fire from the gods and gave it to the people so that they could be sovereign, so that they could be gods unto themselves and stop being reliant on anything else. And so with this Uranus here by the eclipse in Taurus, we're looking at like a potential reconfiguration around values, a reconfiguration around resources, like potential job change or a different way that we're holding or making money, or the current resources that we have in our lives that we rely on. There could potentially be a change there. And with Uranus, a lot of the time, I see his action as in service to more sovereignty and individuation. And again, individuation is one of those highly codified subjects in which I think that there is a kind of unhealthy mimic of that in the collective that says that hyper individuality and like hyper capacity to go it alone is somehow a healthy archetype, and it's not. We need each other. We need love and interdependency and co-regulation. People need people. It is the most fundamental and basic need of a human being. And so anytime I'm speaking to archetypes, I would hope that people have it in their mind that that's all based in or rooted in this idea of love and service to others, because it's really the most fundamental thing we have. This chart is also heavy in earth and heavy in fixed energy. And so that's coming back to this embodiment piece, this piece that says that it is time to get rooted in our bodies. It is time to notice when we are dissociated. It is time to begin to track the places in which we are easily carted away by distraction, by resistance to the thing that we need to do, and come back home to our body. There are no shortages of embodiment practices that people can do. But, one of the sad things as we're talking about evolutionary energies that I've seen happen in the collective, and it's partially a symptom of the Aquarian age as well, is that, we went through this very shocking, almost traumatizing time. Like, I know when we look back at the pandemic, we might not hold it that way now, but I want you to remember how it felt to be like on this side of the world watching the news of China, not knowing what was going on. It was an unknown, silent thing coming to, like Trump used those words, I think, like a silent invader. But in a sense, he was pointing to a very real psychological, psychic phenomenon, right? It was a scary time. And a lot of people I talked to had really wild and out of control anxiety. And I dealt with some of that myself because it's human and I'm human, right? And so there was this gigantic collective nervous system activation. And have we really spent some time healing the nervous system, getting regrounded again, being in our bodies? It was so easy to dissociate because the body was such an unfriendly, almost hostile place to be in the beginning of the pandemic. It was so easy to just let the mind get hijacked by whatever narrative was on the news. Remember, we were in the Gemini Sagittarius axis at that time. It was so easy to just get disembodied or to binge watch something because the body just, it felt so uncomfortable to be inside this like high adrenaline, high anxiety place. That, you've got to ask yourself, have I done everything I need to do to, be in relationship with my body after having experienced such a high intensity, protracted period of time? So yes, there is also that piece. And then we have also Pluto squaring Jupiter in this eclipse. So you can see Pluto here at 0 degrees of Aquarius and Jupiter at 27 degrees of Aries, and then the nodal axis is here. And so this is a really big, big transit. So Pluto, like we said, is engaged with this, with part of how we understand our personal power. It's a very powerful signature, and we really tend to see how Pluto plays out in the collective. And then we've got Jupiter, who is expansive and benevolent, and he is associated with abundance and just magnifying, right? Just making bigger all of these things. And so this is another place where we want to look at the potential like abuse or misuse of power, misappropriation of power. Potentially Jupiter coming in to clean out some of the toxicity around power. But it's also on the flip side a great time to implement things because if you can tap into the kind of benevolence and expansion of Jupiter and his beautiful philosophical, spiritual, uplifting themes and pack some of that plutonic power behind it, there's a real opportunity to grow something. So if you're in a creative portal in your own personal life, if you can harness these energies, it's a great time to get some inspiration and almost like stamina behind you for this transit to help you do some of the heavy lifting of that which you are birthing into the world. And especially if that which you are birthing has some kind of plutonic theme to it, which, he rules like detoxification, revealing, depth psychology, scorpionic stuff, taboo themes, things like that, right? So if the thing you want to birth is kind of in a plutonic realm, and you can harness that Jupiterian energy that just kind of enlightens and enlivens and expands what it touches, there is real potential for good. You just have to watch yourself. Jupiter can be related to hubris and the ego kind of inflating itself, having more confidence than is attached to reality in a way, and misusing power, right? Like the toxic use of power. And so just balancing these two out. So as you get the wind in your sails, making sure that you stay humble and grounded as the impulses continue to ripple through you. Then we still have Mars in Cancer. He is going to be in Cancer for just a little while longer. He is he's been there for almost 8 weeks, and in a sense has the capacity, especially when he first goes into the sign and we're not used to it, to really kind of rile the pain body, to rile the emotions, kind of have some disturbance like on the domestic or the home front. Sometimes the archetype of mother can come into play. And so with him finally exiting Cancer in the coming weeks, some of that will have resolved, and some of the like kind of sometimes he can bring in some insecurities based on the inflammation he brings to the emotional body. Some of that will start to dissipate as he moves into Leo, which is really nice. I wrote a piece about our origins and how, whenever I think of Aries, I think of the age of Aries, which would have been like the time of Judaism and the beginning of written history, like Genesis, right? And so I was thinking about Jupiter and his benevolence and his light and his philosophy, and how he is squaring Pluto in Aquarius, and Aquarius is kind of like our time. And it brought me back to the origin stories that we live inside of. Like, we do live inside of archetypal patterns and mythology. They are the stories that kind of guide our lives, that allow us to know. So they kind of help us know what's acceptable and not. And they've been rewritten time and time again. So I started out this eclipse season. So, or I guess we won't call it an eclipse season, this evolutionary axis season, this Taurus Scorpio season, by talking about the Garden of Eden and retelling a story about when, after I had my daughter is Palestinian, so my husband's Palestinian. After I had her, we went to go and get her christened at the church, but the only church that was available was this Melkite Catholic church. So it's associated with the Melkite is like based in Lebanon, or it's this Middle Eastern type of Catholic church. And how I was asked to not go inside the sanctuary of the church, but in the middle of winter, she was born in February, to walk outside. Like, we met the priest, he said hello to us, and then he told us we had to go back outside and walk around pretty long parking lot and drive down to the front entrance of the sanctuary. So like in the vestibule of the temple, not inside the sanctuary, to do the christening. And when I asked why we couldn't walk through the church because it was freezing outside and we had newborn babies with us, he had told me I was unclean because I was still bleeding. And so I had written this piece all about kind of like the Garden of Eden and this really warped idea that a woman who is bleeding literal lifeblood would ever in any way be some kind of unpure that would be unacceptable to God. Like, that's just insane. And so, one of the other themes that I've been working with myself as a Venusian priestess who is devoted to that path has been really the reclamation of all of my emotions and all of my dark side and all of my scorpionic nature, right? So that's all of the taboos, all of the unconscious, all of the shadow, the darkness, what lives in the fertile deep. And like bringing the light of, this is Taurus, right? The light of love and approval and just bestowing kind of a benevolent blessing on all of the scorpionic pieces of me, right? Giving it all permission to exist so that I can come into a very deep and embodied relationship with my own humanity. Because I was raised very Christian, and this idea of just always pacing towards the light, and turning my back on the darkness because it was bad or somehow evil, had been a path in my life. And there's a lot of deconditioning and unwinding to do there. And how, I was, as a child, sent to my room anytime I'd cry, and how, and told to stay there until I felt better. And how, as I got older, in my early 20s, I was in a relationship with somebody who anytime I like displayed anything but stoicism, would tell me I was insane, you know, and talk to me like, look, you're hysterical. I can't talk to you when you're like this. And it was like a form of gaslighting emotion, right? And how deeply I found that the idea of being good was associated in this, like I said at the beginning, this deep epigenetic program with emotions, and how I had been in such an orientation toward emotion that I had to manage it somehow or I wasn't good, right? So I wrote a nice long transmission for this eclipse. So to accompany this piece, this video here, about how I think that we have our origin stories wrong. And that, you know, there's these two stories about women in the beginning, the in the beginning stories. One is the one with Eve, and she ate the apple, and that precipitated the fall of man. And then the other in the beginning stories, like how women came to be from a patriarchal lens, um, is that as a punishment for Prometheus giving the fire of the gods to the people, Zeus sent the people, who were only men supposedly at the time, he sent them the curse of women. So he sent them the mother of women, which is Pandora, and her box of shadows. And it was her curiosity that opened that box of shadows, that had all of the misery and suffering of mankind inside, right? All of the disgusting and awful and taboo things, that anything we can think of that has a negative connotation inside was part of something that Pandora opened. And then the idea that Eve, you know, her very bite of the apple would have been the thing that set us on this awful path and kept us outside of Eden. And how I really hold that as wrong, like just so completely a distortion of what actually what the meaning of their story was. And that in opening the box of shadows, and that in eating the bite of the apple, what they actually gave us was the gift of humanity. It was the gift of duality, the gift of shadow and light, the gift to know paradox. And that's why I always say that the feminine is paradox. She is the both and she gives us this really lush experience of what it is to be human and incarnate and alive. And so I hope that, you know, this conversation may have inspired something in you, or landed in such a way that you're like, yes, I recognize that I've been on a similar trajectory, and you can understand how completely guided we are by the stars, and that there is truly, truly, truly a relationship of as above, so below. It's such a deep relationship, and how guided and loved and you know, deeply attuned we are to what's happening in the sky. So whether we're aware with it of it or not, this really sacred relationship between as above and so below, whether we're aware of it or not, doesn't matter. It's happening anyways. And it is just so thrilling and so exciting and so expansive and so evolutionary to be on this kind of celestial, embodied, incarnate path, and to do it with you all. So thank you so much for tuning in to this eclipse. There's so much more I can talk about, but I don't like making these transmissions super long. So I will post the video, and I will post a link to that last transmission that I was talking about. And I would love, 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 love to hear your feedback and your comments. I'd love to hear how you're using your voice. I'd love to hear how, as a Venusian priestess, you are standing up for your values, or being a stand for. Like, we don't have to stand in the way that we're activists and we're coming against and we're asking the patriarchy to please, you know, give us our rights. No, but how are you embodying your values? How are you being a stand for what you believe, for your truth? How are you speaking that? How are you in service, Vesta, to that? You know, what have you been accumulating? What new resources have you noticed that have come in? And what have you purged? What have you shed? What have you let go? What have you noticed is no longer true for you, and you are in the process of lovingly releasing it? Have you been to the underworld in this period? And what has that been like for you? I would love all of these reflections. I love staying in conversation. It's so important. It absolutely feeds me. So I hope this has fed you, and we can continue to nourish each other in sisterhood, in devotion to the planets and our priestess path. Bye-bye.